Welcome, friends who are just joining us. Again, my name is Frances Kramer. I'm the Director of Education at Pendle Hill. Since 1930, Pendle Hill has been an experiment in spiritual learning community in Wallingford, Pennsylvania, on Lenape land. And today we welcome friends into this experiment in many different ways, including these First Monday lectures. Tonight, we have the blessing of hearing from Adria Gulizia on embracing spiritual gifts. Adria will share with us for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then there will be an opportunity for question and answer afterwards. In order to support Adria's focus, we will be keeping friends muted and invite you to ask questions throughout the lecture and in the question and answer period directly to me, the host, in the chat. I will distill these questions to share with Adria. I will now introduce Adria, who is a lawyer, mediator, teacher, and mother. She carries a concern for how friends' traditional faith and practice translate into an increasingly unstable, atomized, and uncertain world. In her ministry activities and in her daily life, Adria is passionate about inviting all into deeper relationship with the Spirit of Christ, which spoke so strongly to early friends and continues to speak today. She is a member of Chatham's Summit monthly meeting, New York yearly meeting, the Friends of Jesus Fellowship, and the Board of Advisors of Earlham School of Religion, for which she will serve as clerk starting in fall 2022. She has facilitated workshops on a variety of topics, including spiritual gifts, listening as a practice of pastoral care, and Friends' traditional commitment to the Lamb's War. She recently facilitated a workshop on being a people grounded in tenderness as part of Wendy Cooler's ongoing series on Quaker testimonies to mercy. Welcome, Adria. Welcome, friends. We will now settle into waiting worship and ask Adria to speak to us from the silence.
Good evening, friends. What a blessing to be with you this evening. What a blessing and what a privilege to share with you some thoughts about spiritual gifts and how they shape our communities. I firmly believe that many of the problems and concerns that we face today as friends, stagnant growth, unresolved conflict, and occasionally, or more than occasionally, spiritual community that does not reach the depths to which we are called, are much more easily comprehended in light of the reality that we may all be listening carefully for God, but still come away with different understandings. What early friends knew and what we must rediscover is that those different understandings cannot be left untouched in our consciences. In order to clearly hear God's call, we must bring those understandings back to community, back to the light, to learn from each other, to listen together, and to move forward in God's will and way. A note before we dive in. I came to Friends as a way of approaching the gospel. And as we have our conversation this evening, I want to invite each of us to use the language that feels most comfortable for us. I will use the language for spiritual matters that thoroughly reflects my faith, which I found echoed so powerfully and articulated so powerfully by George Fox, that Christ is the true light that enlightens every person who comes into the world. That's my identity as a friend, and I make no apologies for it. But I never want my approach to be a stumbling block for anyone as they journey closer to divine reality. So please, I invite you to translate, if you need to, into a language that feels more true to your experience. And now, let's start with a few stories. There once was a meeting with a chronically disruptive attender. He would get up during worship regularly and share these long lectures of 5, 10 minutes or more, painstakingly expounding on topics of little or no interest to most of the gathered friends in excruciating detail. It was a big problem for many in the meeting, to the point that just seeing him across the worship room would make hearts sink. People would try to speak with him about it, but he did not seem to respond to their gently worded messages about his ministry's length, tone, and content. What could be done? Here's another one. A friend was thrilled at how much her meeting had grown during the pandemic. There were new attenders in person. There were new attenders online. They were so diverse and so engaged and so excited to be among friends. And she was connecting with each of them and welcoming them into the community. But one by one, they began to leave the meeting, alienated by incidents that were taking place within the community. She was tearing her hair out with frustration. What did it mean? Why did friends in her meeting seem to be undermining the growth of their community? And here's a final story. A friend in meeting had given ministry about the 23rd Psalm, speaking poetically about God as the Good Shepherd. In afterthoughts, another friend stood up and shared that as we are all rational, modern people, surely none of us would want to be a sheep in God's flock or anywhere else. A third friend stood and responded to the prior one, an action that was consistent with that meeting's practice in afterthoughts. She said that if we were too good to be in God's flock, we should think twice about calling ourselves friends and claiming to obey the Spirit. This friend was called by a member of ministry and council and eldered about her unwelcoming tone. She struggled to understand how the friend who eldered her, a friend she liked and respected very much, could feel so sure that it was okay for another friend to promote a pridefulness that, as she saw it, struck at the very heart of Quaker faith, while her own call to faithful obedience and humility was somehow unacceptable. What was going on? What was going on in each of these cases was the predictable consequence of our lack of familiarity with and comfort with spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts are manifestations of the Spirit's power among us. Anywhere people are following the light of Christ, spiritual gifts are at work, whether we notice them or not, whether we name them or not. If we appropriately nurture and support these gifts, we will see powerful ministry, tender outreach, generous service, and loving, responsible relationships. If we don't, we will see unresolved conflict, pervasive frustration, and the ultimate destruction of our communities, which will starve our souls with lack of substance, stifle our spirits with rigid legalism, wound our hearts with anything goes self-indulgence, or wither away due to lack of effective outreach. Before we dive into our exploration together, I want to lay a foundation, starting with the question, what are spiritual gifts? Lest you think I am smarter and more educated than I really am. Much of what I'm about to say comes directly from Khaled and Christina Keith Perry's series, The Jewels of Quakerism, which you can find on YouTube. They have an episode on spiritual gifts, which I watched and rewatched during my preparation, and I highly recommend it. Another resource that you might want to take a look at is Primal Fire, which is a book on spiritual gifts as well, and that has also been deeply informative. And you can ask me more in the Q&A about resources if you'd like. But here goes. In the New Testament Greek, the word for spiritual gifts is pneumatikos, from pneuma, which means breath or spirit. It's notable that pneumatikos is more directly translated not as spiritual gifts, but as manifestations of the Spirit. The word gift might be misleading. A gift might be something you get for Christmas because you've been a good boy or girl. But pneumatikos has nothing to do with our character or our virtue or our closeness to God, which is why you can see people who are phenomenally gifted spiritually, but a total train wreck personally. We receive spiritual gifts not because we are good, but because God is good. The gifts are evidence of God's power and grace. So what are these gifts? Next slide, please. There are different ways of thinking about them. Friends have traditionally broken out giftedness into three categories. Ministers, who speak on the doctrinal content of our faith and regularly offer God-given messages during worship. Elders, who provide support and discipline for ministers and spiritually ground and nurture our meeting communities as a whole. And overseers, who provide practical care for the concrete needs of the community. So that's one way of thinking about spiritual gifts, based in part on biblical categories found in the books of Titus, 1 Timothy, and elsewhere. Then there are gift inventories. One that I really like is from an excellent book called The Three Colors of Ministry. It actually names 30, maybe even more than 30 spiritual gifts, from speaking in tongues to counseling, from administration to song, from counseling to alleviating spiritual oppression. This is a huge variety of ways to contribute to the blessed community. And for me, it represented, when I read it, an invitation to expand the variety of ways I understand God's gifts. And of course, the Bible itself has plenty to say about spiritual gifts. Romans 12 gives us one possible list: prophecy, service, teaching, encouraging, giving, leading, and mercy. And put a pin in that, please, because as Francis mentioned, Wendy Cooler is currently hosting a 7-part workshop series, which I participated in just a couple weeks ago as a facilitator on a Quaker testimony of mercy. The next session is coming up this weekend. Then 1 Corinthians 12 gives us another list: words of wisdom, words of knowledge, the gift of faith, the gift of healing, working miracles, prophecy, the discernment of spirits, and speaking in and interpreting tongues. Sometimes these gifts, or gifts of the nature that are in this list, make friends, at least friends like me, a little squirmy because it feels a little more, well, I'll just put it like this, a little out there for my experience. I will say, though, that that these types of gifts have a strong pedigree among friends, from George Fox's Book of Miracles to the present day. And I have been incredibly blessed by praying and worshiping with friends who had more of these charismatic expressions, such as praying in tongues. But as interesting a topic as that would be, and as interesting a focus as that would be, and maybe that'll be another lecture at another time, I'm going to focus in this talk on the gifts of the Spirit described in Ephesians 4, the so-called APEST gifts: the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers. I'm focusing on these gifts because the Bible suggests that lifting up these voices needs to happen in each and every community of believers in order for the community to reach spiritual maturity and avoid being led astray. As an aside, for those friends who might be wondering about how your own gifts may map onto the APEST framework, I would invite you to consider these two questions. In what situations do you feel that God acts through you most powerfully? And in what situations do you find yourself most in conflict with your community? And if you hold those questions in your mind as we go into more depth about the giftings, you may get more insight into which gift or gifts are most active in your ministry. Apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. What do these words mean? Next slide, please. We'll start with apostles. Apostles show us God's creativity. They are builders of new ministries, new initiatives, new communities that inspire others and grow far beyond their founders. Apostles usually travel and seed new things in new places. A paradigmatic example of the apostle gift among friends would be George Fox, who gathered around an apostolic band, which we know as the Valiant 60, to spread the message of the new Quaker movement across England, Europe, the Caribbean, United States, and even parts of Asia. The gift of the apostle to the community is constant refreshment and renewal. Apostolic energy is very sensitive to the needs of the moment and very ready to meet those needs with visionary new ideas and initiatives in response to moves of the Spirit. The struggles of the apostle? Apostles may be impatient with the idea of bringing people along. They might start something without a proper foundation. They are likely to hear that as Quakers, we've always done it this way, as a rebuttal to their suggestions. Our limited infrastructure and financial support for released ministry is also a challenge for apostles, as their work can easily become consuming. Next slide, please. Next, we move to the prophets. Prophets show us God's holiness. They are watchful soldiers in the battle between good and evil, warriors of the Lamb who remind believers of God's call and are willing to stand up to ungodliness and untruth wherever they find it. Individuals with this gifting are notable for the fact that they have an overriding need to declare God's truth, no matter how little others may wish to hear it. I would use as a paradigmatic example of a faithful prophet among friends, John Woolman, whose very life, his clothing choices, the way that he decided not to expand his business, all reflected a keen sensitivity to God's call. He labored tirelessly for fair labor, among other things, and his ministry is one that we still know and talk about today. The gift of the prophet to the community The prophet lives as an example of radical faithfulness, often calling the community beyond what others believe is possible. The prophet also sounds the alarm when the community is refusing to heed the divine call or is at risk of embracing a way of being that violates God's will. The struggles of the prophet? They may be frustrated by the discipline of living in a community where others don't immediately receive their ministry. They'll be tempted to take their marbles and go home rather than submitting to oversight. Community may view the prophet as a troublemaker, as an agitator, or as a source of conflict, rather than taking in the real truth in the prophet's words. On the flip side, prophets sometimes develop a tendency to see only where the community falls short. And in the process, they miss what God is doing within the community and the individuals in it. Next slide, please. Next, we have the evangelists. Evangelists show us God's invitational love. They interpret the divine message to those who haven't heard it or haven't internalized it, welcoming them into the family of faith and sharing their contagious enthusiasm for the way of the Spirit. Individuals with this gift tend to be able to meet newcomers where they are and speak to their needs and questions to invite them into a new relationship with the Spirit and the community. Evangelists build bridges between followers of the light and the wider world. A paradigmatic example of the evangelist among friends would be Mary Fisher, who sailed to Barbados with another woman minister. And when she did that, after her ministry trip there, the lieutenant governor of Barbados became a convinced friend. She's best known for her mission to share Friend's message with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a very bold move for an Englishwoman in that time. The gift of the evangelist to the community? The evangelist is passionate about outreach and is sensitive to the needs of those first encountering our faith. This persistent love for those who are not yet at the table keeps the community from becoming insular and withering away. And what are the struggles of the evangelist? Well, they might be so passionate about creating a warm and welcoming environment for newcomers that they downplay the harder parts of the walk of faith. The light doesn't just comfort and affirm us, but also challenges and convicts us. Among friends, evangelists might be tempted to offer a least common denominator view of Quakerism. You'll love it, they say, because you can believe whatever you want. Alternatively, they may be disillusioned when the meeting cannot effectively welcome the newcomers who they have invited in. Next slide, please. Next, we have the shepherds. Shepherds show us God's tenderness. They create a space where all are welcome and where people can experience God's love through the love they feel in community. The paradigmatic example of the shepherd among friends, among unprogrammed friends, I would say, would be our retreat center youth directors or Quaker camp directors who are absolute experts at building loving, caring communities among the young people that they serve. What are the gifts of the shepherds to the community? Well, shepherding, it's important to note, is the most common gifting. Shepherds ground our communities in love and care. They keep us happy and comfortable and connected with each other. The struggles of the shepherd? They may be so concerned about maintaining a harmonious community that they may not know how to respond to attitudes and behaviors that undermine the foundation of Quaker faith and Quaker community, whether that is beliefs and actions incompatible, with a vibrant Quaker faith and witness, or dysfunctional relational patterns within the community. A true shepherd understands that real peace means addressing deep conflict not just maintaining a facade of harmony. But addressing that conflict may involve hurt feelings on all sides. Next slide, please. Finally, we have the teachers. Teachers show us God's wisdom. They want to learn, know, understand, and share their insights with the community so that all may stand in truth with a capital T and understand the reality that God has created in all of its fullness. The paradigmatic example of a teacher among friends would be Robert Barclay, who, as the exception that proved the rule about Friends' aversion to systematic theology, wrote his Apology for True Christian Divinity as a systematic exposition and defense of the Quaker faith. The gift of the teacher to the community? Well, teachers help us articulate the timeless knowledge of truth and understand the spiritual reality that we live in. Solid teaching grounds us and helps us interpret our world in ways that draw us closer to God and to each other, as well as reminding us that we are connected to a history and tradition that stretches across time. The struggles of the teacher? Well, they might become enamored of the perfect description of truth or the Quaker way and forget that knowledge must be lived out, not just known intellectually. We must be a possessor, not just a professor of truth, as early Friends said. Among unprogrammed friends, teachers sometimes struggle with finding an outlet for their gift. What they have to say is too long and detailed for most meeting for worship ministry, but a lot of meetings don't have an ongoing commitment to religious education. Next slide, please. So we see that these gifts represent aspects of God and reflect these aspects back to our community. The apostle shows us God's nature as a creator. The prophet witnesses to God's presence and power. The evangelist shows us God's invitational love. The shepherd shows us God's tender care. And the teacher shows us the breadth and depth of God's wisdom. These are all critical parts of who God is and who we are called to be. Dynamic, holy, invitational, tender, and wise. But you can already see, I'm guessing, where problems can arise. Think back to the stories we started with. That disruptive attender who always gave the long-winded messages, he clearly had a teaching gift. But without an opportunity to offer his knowledge to the meeting, that gift came out at a time and in a place where the meeting wasn't ready to receive it. So instead of being blessed by his teaching and affirming him in his giftedness, many in the meeting saw him as a nuisance and marginalized him from relationship. Moreover, at least among liberal friends, there are many wounded people whose main attraction to Quakerism is that nobody tells you what to think. In that environment, there may even be an active rejection of the teaching gift. And so instead of being built up by the teachers that God has sent us, we set them to the side. And that welcoming friend who couldn't understand why new attenders were leaving her meeting, she has a gift of evangelism that is at odds with the self-concept of friends in her meeting. Have you ever heard the phrase, Quakers don't proselytize? Aside from being extremely misleading, after all, the Valiant 60 was a band that spread Quakerism, as I said, across continents. It does reflect a perspective that many friends share. Quakerism, they might say, isn't for everyone. The corollary of this, which is often left unsaid, is that Quakerism is for people like us. If many of us believe that Quakerism is just for people like us, that is, that Quakerism isn't for everyone, we won't be thoughtful about providing a welcome to new attenders. We certainly won't feel any urgency to invite people in our networks to join our communities. And we won't be thoughtful about what parts of our Quaker path are essential doctrine that we need to hold fast to, and what parts are mere culture, which we can let go of. In fact, if Quakerism is just for people like us, then anyone who leaves wasn't meant to be here in the first place, and we're all fine just the way we are, because if we weren't, we wouldn't be here. This attitude, if you're one of us, you'll know it, and if you aren't, well, we wish you the very best in the faith community you ultimately land at, drives people with gifts of evangelism up a wall. And more importantly, it's not true. If we believe that there is that of God within everyone, and if we believe that God loves us and seeks us, if we believe that we can know God and be led by him into a new life and a new way of being with each other and with creation, and we believe that the best way to do that is by expectant waiting informed by scripture and fellowship and reflection with other godly people, well, that actually is something pretty important and pretty special. That's something that maybe could be for everyone, whether they're ready to receive it or not. And that doesn't mean that everybody should be a friend, and that doesn't mean that God isn't working in other places too, but it does mean that we should at least ask ourselves whether or not we're inviting the right people into our meetings. And if we want to hoard the Quaker faith for people who are like us, generally white, well-educated, and well-heeled, then we are not following the example of the Spirit, who keeps inviting us into relationship, even when we are unpopular, unlovable, and even unfaithful. In fact, the God I believe in, the God early friends believed in, the God testified to in the Bible, has a special preference for people who are poor, people who are sick or suffering, people without great education or wealth, people who are marginalized and excluded. Evangelists call us out of our comfort zone to share the invitation into holy community across social boundaries. Maybe if we honored the gifts of our evangelists, our meetings' preferences would better reflect God's preferences. And finally, do you remember that friend who gave the afterthought, warning that if we are too proud to be part of God's flock, we have no business calling ourselves friends? Well, she was exercising a prophetic gift, sounding a warning that the meeting was veering into dangerous waters and cutting itself off from submission to the Spirit. The friend who eldered her was leaning into her own shepherding gift. Shepherding is the one gift that I've seen reliably supported in our meetings. And shepherds really want things to be pleasant and comfortable for the people who are already part of the community. As a shepherd, that friend had a special concern for whether the meeting felt welcoming and safe. And that concern for her was stronger than whether truth was being lifted up during the time of worship. It's important to lift up that neither friend was wrong in their concern. It is important that the meeting be a welcoming community that people enjoy being a part of and staying in. And it is also important that statements that undermine the very root of our faith be open for response. This is how we maintain our corporate identity. That tension, warm and faithful, safe and challenging, is hard to navigate. And we will only do the work of becoming a community that does both when we understand that just picking one or the other, rather than integrating the two, is a betrayal of our calling as people of God. And you can end the slideshow here. We see this dynamic of gifts being pitted against each other rather than integrated in many parts of the unprogrammed Quaker world today. I have absolutely no doubt that the anti-racism work in my yearly meeting and many others are my yearly meeting and many others are doing at this moment is God-given prophetic labor. As a Black friend in particular, I have been alternately hurt and bewildered at the lack of self-awareness I have witnessed around racial issues in some quarters of friends. So I'm very glad that this work is underway. But I have followed the conflicts that often accompany the work, and I see the impact of gift ignorance on full display. Often, that looks like devoted shepherds trying to preserve group safety and cohesion at the expense of prophetic truth telling. But sometimes it looks like prophetic friends, some of whom have never experienced spirit led Quaker faith and practice, and who are not as sensitive to the health of the community, dismissing our traditional practices as intrinsically white supremacist, while not seeing the harm done to our communities and our witness by abandoning them without discernment. Rather than dismissing one another, either as mere troublemakers on one hand or as rank white supremacists on the other, though there's definitely some of each at play in certain situations as well. Greater awareness of the reality of diverse spiritual gifting might invite curiosity and patience rather than conflict and contempt. Imagine if the shepherds began asking how the community could be not just cared for, but faithful to God's call, while the prophets explore what it could look like to unite God's undeniable truth with his irresistible love. Now picture them seeking out teachers for their knowledge of how friends in the early church discerned around hard issues in the past, and apostles to identify what new structures we might need to support our work together. Wouldn't that be an amazingly dynamic spiritual ecosystem for the evangelist to invite people into? People hungry for connection, for justice, for spiritual sustenance. We need each other, friends. And the scripture passages about gifts are even clearer about how much we need each other, how it is our duty to love each other and commit to each other and exercise our gifts together, even when it is hard. Here's a passage from Romans 12. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. And from Corinthians 12, just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. We all belong to the body of believers, and we all belong to each other. It is in cherishing each other, listening to each other, learning from each other, and sometimes disagreeing with each other, that we grow closer to God. In the words of Patricia Loring, we are ministering life-giving Spirit of God to one another in countless nameable and unnameable ways. To call one another to live more consciously and with more commitment into our gifts and their implications is to invite one another into more abundant life. Each person who opens himself up to more abundant life opens more abundant life for the community as a whole. So how do we foster that abundant life? How do we welcome that life-giving Spirit of God? First, we have to acknowledge our ambivalence about naming spiritual gifts in each other. As Chuck Fager wrote in his article, The Trouble with Ministers, for most of Friends' history, friends in all branches recorded gifts of ministry. But liberal, unprogrammed friends ultimately put an end to the practice, more or less. I would nuance friend Chuck on that one. But as he says, They had concluded, based on long and painful experience, that the offices of elder and minister did more harm than good to the society. These friends were saying loud and clear that the testimony of equality was meant to apply within the society as well as outside it. They were also making a theological statement. The work of spirit-led ministry belongs to all friends according to their/our varied gifts and callings. Acknowledging Ephesians 4 spiritual gifts certainly does not require recording gifts of ministry, but some of our anxiety around a two-tier system of ministry still seems to remain, as though some of us feel that our testimony of equality dictates that not only do we all have gifts, but that those gifts should be treated as interchangeable. They are not. And knowing each other in the spirit means having a sense of each other's gifts. And each of us generally has one or two that we primarily operate in as we mature in the spirit. If we don't actively open our awareness of all the Ephesians 4 gifts, we are very likely, in our human frailty, to gravitate toward things that make us feel good, like the loving welcome of the shepherding gift and the spiritual uplift of certain aspects of the prophetic gift, and to shy away from things that make us feel uncomfortable, like the hard truths shared by the teacher or prophet, or the apostles' call to renewal, or the evangelist's insistence that we welcome difficult people. Human beings have a natural resistance to being challenged, and friends are not exempt from that resistance. So when a friend's ministry or behavior or speech makes us uncomfortable, we need to get into the habit of asking ourselves, is there truth in this? Is there light in this? Is there God in this? We need to be attentive to those friends whose real gifts we need to receive, even if they are being exercised uncomfortably, imperfectly, or immaturely. We also need to understand the difference between gifts and ministry. A while back, I was on a search committee for a job in a Quaker organization. We had two wonderful candidates as finalists. One very clearly had a shepherding gift, while the other seemed to have a prophetic and evangelistic orientation. Because of my familiarity with spiritual gifts, I was able to articulate that fact. I then observed that either one of them would probably do a great job, but that they would do a very different job. One would be nurturing and stable, the other would be dynamic and challenging. This was very helpful to the search committee as we considered what the organization needed in that moment. A spiritual gift is not a job description. A teacher or a prophet might be called to a ministry of writing. An evangelist or a shepherd might be called to start a youth group. The gifting does not dictate the ministry, but it will shape the flavor that the ministry takes on. And that is a wonderful thing. As a note, we sometimes seem to use the fact that many unprogrammed friends have laid down the practice of recording to justify our lack of support or even our active disparagement of others' ministry. You've maybe heard the quote that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. For some friends, lack of recording or other acknowledgement of gifts and callings seems to mean that my lack of commitment is just as good as your faithful obedience. Wherever that attitude exists, it is corrosive to community. Yes, we should make a discipline of loving and appreciating each other, but integrity demands that we also make a discipline of naming and giving thanks for faithful ministry among us, whatever form that takes. Another way that we welcome all gifts, that we can welcome all gifts, is to name people's gifts and to invite them to serve. Before I knew anything about spiritual gifts, I was asked to revive my meeting at the time, their defunct advancement committee. This was my first ever clerking role. It would take me 5 years to find out what they already knew, that I had a passion for our faith and for inviting others into it. Never mind that at the time I had been a friend for less than a year. Never mind that I was a 21-year-old newly minted school teacher who didn't even have a car. I was immersed in the community. They knew me and they gave me a chance to constitute a committee, to do workshops on inreach, and to serve my meeting with joy and enthusiasm. Naming gifts and inviting corresponding service is one way of giving a sense of purpose and direction to one's participation in the community. If a committee nomination is made because someone had to do it and we figured you wouldn't say no, it will feel like a burden. But if it's made because we think you might have a gift and we would love to see how God uses you, well, that is an altogether different thing. If you're wondering how to get to know each other's gifts, that's probably a sign that now is the time to deepen your knowledge of each other in the spirit. Having religious education activities before or after meeting can increase participation, especially if there's food, deepen our individual faith lives, and help us know each other in deeper and more profound ways. Experiencing how we think about and talk about spiritual topics can give us insight into each other's gifts. Is someone meticulous and detail-oriented, always doing additional reading or volunteering to present? They may have a teaching gift. Is someone very focused on the experience of God's presence or the revelation of divine truth? Do they have a passion for justice? They may have a prophetic gift. Does someone get excited about how they can share their newfound knowledge with people outside the meeting, or do they care passionately about welcoming new attenders? They may have an evangelistic gift. Does someone always volunteer to host or bring refreshments? They may have a shepherding gift. Does someone want to start a new network or ministry inspired by what they're learning? They may have an apostolic gift. As we name gifts, we need to provide support and nurture. Do multiple people in your meeting have a similar calling? Connect them so they can learn from each other. If you see a retreat or workshop that would support the gifting you see in them, encourage them to attend and make sure they are aware of any meeting funds or pay-as-led options that can reduce the cost. Turn them on to books that will engage and inspire them to go deeper in their faith. Shepherds may benefit from learning conflict resolution strategies, while teachers may benefit from a book on writing as ministry. Books on spiritual awareness and entrepreneurial ministry are well suited to prophets and apostles, while someone with an evangelistic gift may benefit from books on internet outreach. Even if a specific recommendation doesn't land, developing a culture in which friends consciously nurture each other's spiritual growth will naturally deepen relationships and faithfulness within your meeting. It is in the realm of support and nurture where I do think that some form of recording of gifts may still have an important role. A friend who wades into the public sphere, who is a notable public presence, and who engages in public ministry, whether that is writing, board service, speaking, traveling in ministry, or blogging on spiritual topics, needs support from his or her spiritual community to discern how God is calling. If the meeting does not believe that the friend is called by the Spirit to minister publicly, that needs to be made very clear, and that friend needs to wait for a clearer leading. This is our testimony of community in action. But if the meeting believes that the friend is being called to public action, then that needs to be made very clear, either by recording or another public acknowledgement of the Spirit's call on that friend. That is our testimony of integrity in action. And of course, if the meeting believes that God is calling that friend to ministry, there is an obligation to support the ministry financially and logistically, as well as spiritually, to participate corporately in what God is doing through that friend. Finally, but most importantly, one way to support the healthy development of spiritual gifts is not to focus on spiritual gifts at all, but on spiritual fruit. According to Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Sometimes we can lose sight of this reality. Prophets in particular can fall into the trap of sharing in God's righteous anger at friends' blindness or faithlessness or hard-heartedness, but failing to participate in God's enduring patience and relentless love. Each one of us, no matter our gifting, needs to be striving for the fruit of the Spirit. It doesn't matter how powerful your ministry is if you are bitter and angry in your daily life. It doesn't matter how tender your shepherding is if you can't say no to your harmful impulses. No matter how creative your ministry is, if you are cheating on your spouse, you are not following God. As George Fox said, we are called to be children of light and to walk in the light and to speak that which comes to us inwardly from God. A knowledge of gifts will help us understand that what I hear from God and what you hear from God will not be exactly the same. But we are all called to listen to each other and to love one another, to be patient with each other, to submit graciously to one another, to learn to say no to ourselves and yes to the love and joy and peace that God offers us in community. Only by coming together in love and humility can we live into the fullness of God's will and the goodness of the kingdom of heaven. The welcoming of spiritual gifts is so near to my heart because I believe that, as I said at the beginning, many of the challenges we're facing today are predictable fruit of rejecting the Spirit's work among us. In my corner of the Quaker world, the liberal, unprogrammed friends of the Northeastern United States, the prevailing cultural norms among friends seem to be fairly well defined. We place a very high value on educational and career success. We place a very high value on individual decision-making and autonomy. We have a strong desire to be seen as good, to be accepted, and to be affirmed. And we place a very high value on being inclusive, accepting, and non-judgmental. Now listen, none of these are bad values at all. They're wonderful values, and I share them. But I also can't help but notice how closely these Quaker values align with the values of the white middle class, where self-expression is valued more highly than mutual care and cooperation, where individual accomplishments are more valued than the bonds of love and loyalty within the group. In a functional society where hard work and a measure of intelligence reliably correlate to financial and personal stability, where connections to family and neighbors and communities of faith are assumed and upheld, these values push us towards excellence and inclusion. But in our current situation of unequal opportunity, wealth hoarding, and the near total collapse of our middle class, with our families in a constant state of crisis, with religious and civic participation at an all-time low, these values are killing us. Apart from a few lucky souls at the top, it is increasingly challenging for the isolated individual to strive his or her way to a decent life. Geographic dispersion, high housing costs, the gig economy, wage stagnation, out of control healthcare, childcare, elder care costs have doomed most individuals acting alone to a constant state of financial and emotional struggle and desperation. The middle class made a bargain. We would forego the judgments and geographic limitations that come with relying on family and community for support, and in exchange, we would pour ourselves into constant enrichment and work, and we would strive our way into a good job and a good life for ourselves and for our children. But that bargain has fallen apart, and the values that fed it no longer lead to material comfort and personal freedom. Instead, for the average American today, those values lead to anxiety, isolation, lack of meaning, and a sense of failure when we can't seem to succeed in a system rigged against us. Perversely, these values also harm us economically, as we are constitutionally less able to commit to each other in informal associations like lending circles, childcare swaps, and mutual aid societies. These associations and the trust and commitment they entail necessarily limit individual freedom and decision-making ability. If I'm asking you to watch my child for free, I'm not really in a position to make a lot of demands about whether TV is watched or juice box is drunk or what enrichment activities are completed. If I commit to contribute $100 a month to a lending circle, I'm on the hook to do it, even if a gorgeous dress comes on sale or I see great tickets for a concert. Unlike in days gone by when doing things you didn't enjoy was seen as building character, today we are told to follow our bliss, to abandon communities that don't feed us, to cut toxic people out of our lives. Against that backdrop, is it any wonder that few people are eager to join a bunch of strangers to sit quietly for an hour and then drink coffee of highly variable quality? Is it any wonder that among those who do show up, conflict or dissatisfaction quickly push them toward the door? Our culture is actively at odds with our Quaker faith. Our faith tells us that we share God's love by remaining in loving relationship with people, even when they are beset by sinful attitudes. For, as Christ said, who needs a doctor but the sick? Our current culture, however, tells us that we are ethically obligated to cut off any individual or community we find morally deficient. Our faith tells us, blessed are the meek, but our culture says that fame is more important than service. Our faith tells us that we will be known as followers of the light of Christ by the love we have for each other. But our culture says that our individuality, rather than our virtue, is our most important trait. The culture and values that made the American middle class the strongest in the world now hinder our ability to connect with each other, and this shows up in how we relate to each other in our Quaker communities. Now that I've cheered everyone up, how does any of this relate to spiritual gifts? With our eyes now open to how each of the APEST gifts gives us insight into God's nature, let's imagine how we might speak into each other's lives and into the lives of our friends and neighbors as spiritually empowered Quaker communities. Our evangelists might find new ways to invite the anxious, the sad, the broke, and the burnt out to reject the illusion that happiness lies in maximizing our choices or finding just the right people to be in relationship with. And instead, we might encourage others to recognize the reality that happiness comes when we step into the life that God is calling us to, not just as individuals, but in loving and supportive community. Our teachers might honor the importance of our individual decision-making and discernment, but also point us to the time-tested wisdom of early friends and the early church. Sometimes ancient wisdom is exactly the new lens we need to break us out of our failed paradigms. Empowered teachers can tie us to the sacred knowledge and wisdom that is part of our heritage and stretches from the prophets of ancient Israel to the first disciples of Christ, to the friends who ministered with George Fox, right down to the present day. Our prophets might lift up our desire to be good as a holy hunger for right relationship with God, with each other, and with all creation. But they might also remind us, along with the prophet Isaiah, that we are men and women of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. Our holiness is perpetually provisional and incomplete, and yet even we may behold the Almighty God. We must confront the reality of our own lack of righteousness in order to fully perceive and appreciate God's grace. But that grace, if we can bring ourselves to accept it, will give us compassion for ourselves and for each other, while renewing our conviction that God's justice and God's love must be made real among us. Our apostles might share the wisdom that playing the education and career game to win in the current system might not be how God is calling us. He might be calling us to something new entirely, something that requires opting out of the rat race and opting into new ways of being and new ways of interacting, even if the world judges us as failures for our lack of outward accomplishments. And our shepherds, our beloved shepherds, might commit to anchoring communities that consciously train their members in the concrete skills of loving that so many of us are lacking today. Things like patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to labor together through difference. These foundational aspects of community life have always been countercultural, and that's very true today in our age of self-sorting and polarization. But our families, our meetings, and our communities need these skills now more than ever. Friends, there is still a great people to be gathered. God is still generous with the gifts of the Spirit. Divine love and divine power are still free for us to use in the building up of the kingdom of heaven. But we will not see that kingdom in its fullness if we only know how to welcome the spiritual gifts that make us feel good and safe and comfortable. Yes, we must welcome the shepherd who shows us God's love in tender fellowship. But we must also welcome the evangelist who pushes us to ask, who is missing from our community? Who is not yet at the table? Who needs to experience divine love and holy communion amidst all of the challenges and struggles of life? We must welcome the teacher who reminds us that our Quaker faith is not just a DIY experiment, but a sacred tradition with rich doctrines and nuanced understandings about the nature of God, the reality of good and evil, the possibility of knowing true spiritual communion with the light and with each other, and the role of Christ, the inward Christ, in empowering us to experience that communion. We must welcome the prophet who invites us to ground our whole being on the power, practice, and presence of God, who calls us to see where we are not yet faithful and to trust that if we step in response to the Spirit's calling, we will not fall. And we must welcome the apostle who clearly sees the limitations of our current practices and institutions and calls us into change. Behold, she says, God is doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Only by welcoming all of the gifts God sends us can we live into our purpose as the religious society of friends. The Spirit is calling. Will we answer?
As I got a message from one of the participants that just said, wow, with many exclamation marks. Well said. Thank you, Adria. Thanks for sharing that with us. Lots of appreciative notes in the chat about the beauty of what you shared. A lot of gratitude. This is an opportunity for us as a community gathered today in this moment to live into the gift of being together in real time. And the chat is now opened for friends to ask questions that they may have to me, the host, and I will be distilling these questions and asking them to Adria. The first question, though, before we get to the questions of the rest of the community, we like to ask our first Monday lecturers where you're feeling spirit alive for you in your work these days. So Adria, if you could give us a little window into where you're feeling spirit alive for you.
Absolutely. The shortest answer is everywhere. Shortest answer is everywhere. What I am seeing. So, okay, let me just give a little context. I've taken to calling tonight's lecture my season finale, because this has been the most intense impact time of ministry of my life ever. And I've been active in ministry, like I said, since I was 21, so like 14 years ago. And in the past 2 months, I've facilitated a meeting retreat and clerked my first board of advisor meetings for ESR and been on 1,000 ministry calls. And it has been super intense. I facilitated a workshop with Wendy Cooler on time to be tender. So how we show up in community for God and for each other. And one thing that I'm seeing everywhere is the realization and the deep knowledge that our ways of doing things, even if they served us in the past, are not going to serve us going forward. And that we've got to experiment, we've got to play, we've got to be present, we've got to be creative, we've got to, we've got to be willing to fail, because if we keep doing what we're doing, we're done. And that's a scary moment in a way, but it's also a really exciting moment, because there is a hunger to have real conversation. There is a hunger to listen carefully and listen deeply. And there is a hunger to grow in faithfulness. And that is amazing in a world and in a time when there's a lot to be depressed about. That is an area of real brightness and excitement and hope for me. the spirit is afoot in our society.
Thank you. We're getting a number of questions about how people can continue to learn from you, and how soon this recording will be available. It will be up on YouTube tomorrow. I will put into the chat our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find this and all our previous First Monday lectures there. There may be an automated transcript. It would be uncorrected. We'll have to look into what type of transcript might be available. There were some earlier questions about the other resources that you had mentioned. I put into the chat already the YouTube link to the Jewels of Quakerism. And I think the other book that you had previously mentioned was Primal Fire. Is that right?
Yes. And I'm just going to confirm really quickly, but I believe that the author of Primal Fire is Neil Cole. And so that is a really good book, because he wrote that in collaboration with 4 other pastors. And I'm like, man, you can tell this guy's not a Northeastern Quaker. Who knows 5 whole pastors? But each one of those pastors operates primarily in a different spiritual gift. And so they were able to write this book collaboratively. There's some ecclesiological stuff that's talking about church structure that is wholly irrelevant to unprogrammed Quakerism. But the heart of the book is about the spiritual gifts. And I just found it incredibly insightful and beautiful, talking about the different faces of God and how they're manifest in our communities.
Are there other resources that you would point friends to who want to learn more about spiritual gifts?
I also mentioned the 3 Colors of Ministry book. That's a really great book. Those are the 3 best resources that I found. But if you have there are also like Quaker classics, like qualifications necessary for a gospel minister by Samuel Bonus, which has a lot about like nurturing gifts of ministry and how to become the kind of person that God can use most effectively for ministry, and how to nurture ministry and community. So that's tremendous. There are Pendle Hill pamphlets on gifts of ministry. One called Tall Poppies by Marty Grundy is about why some of the psychology, I guess, or group dynamics about why we often cut our ministers off at the knees. But there are also a lot of other wonderful pamphlets like the Prophetic Stream about gifts of ministry. There are also in your yearly meetings, you will find, you just keep your ear to the ground, because, for example, there's a healing center every year at Summer Sessions in New York yearly meeting. Those are people operating in like serious prophetic and shepherding gifts, but it's at the intersection of prophetic and shepherding. They are laying on hands. Amazing stuff is happening at those places. But if you don't know, you won't know. And so I am happy. Facebook friend me and we can talk about the different conversations, but there are resources out there, but it really depends on like what your question is, to know kind of how to go deeper. I know that feels like a total cop out.
I think that's a great start. And we can, on the YouTube page, try to distill some of the resources that you mentioned and have those be accessible on the YouTube page as well. I will pick up on one of the things that you just mentioned about prophetic organizations and prophetic spaces. This is something that Pendle Hill has initially envisioned itself as a school for the prophets, and takes prophetic witness as one of the 3 main themes of our educational offerings. There's a question about what other Quaker institutions embody other spiritual gifts in your mind, or if there's an absence of organizations embodying certain gifts, should there be such organizations?
So FGC has done work in their traveling ministry program which I don't know that that really fits into a specific spiritual gifts, but they also have a new meetings project and a lot of supports for new meetings. So so there are people who are thinking about, for example, in that case, evangelism and what that looks like in a Quaker context. There's a, sorry, my brain, School of the Spirit is again in that prophetic, but also in that teaching space. And Pendle Hill, of course, particularly with the pamphlets, is very much in that teaching space. I think that the hardest places, I think that we're as friends, we're really good at welcoming shepherding. We can be excellent at welcoming prophetic gifts. And I think that we've seen this in like all along, passion for earth care, passion for racial justice, passion for prison ministry. Those are all prophetic impulses that bubble up. And in a very real sense, AFSC at its inception was one of the prophetic manifestations in the Religious Society of Friends. Of course, the amount of involvement of actual Quakers in American Friends Service Committee has gone steadily down over the last 50 or 70 years. And there's a story to tell there, which is not mine to tell. But Quaker voluntary service, that space of like helping young adults really get involved in hands-on ways for justice and for care, that intersection of prophetic and shepherding is really beautiful. So there are spaces, but again, I don't know that there's like a directory or a list of spaces. Maybe somebody who has different gifts than me would like to put that together.
That's a lovely invitation. There's a question about multiple gifts. So how you think about the possibility that friends have more than one gift, and then another question about how friends might relate to the gifts that are not their strengths, whether the suggestion is to just allow other people to take care of those things, or whether there's an invitation to also develop those gifts which might not be the primary gift.
Okay, so those are really great questions. One of the things that I really appreciated about Primal Fire is that what they said is, listen, as people mature in these gifts, and you become like the mature prophet, the mature evangelist, the mature shepherd, your job is to then teach others who maybe they don't have that as their primary gift, and yet you can teach them how to be that in whatever way that they can. Because the thesis of the book is that really these 5 gifts are part of the DNA of the Holy Spirit, basically, and that we each carry all of these gifts inside us in a germinal or nascent form, but 1 or maybe 2 of them only will grow to fruition and maturity within us over the course of our lifetime. So sometimes different gifts will come to the fore as needed and then recede. And we as friends know this, right? The laying down of ministries is part of the life cycle of a ministry. But they're all in there, and we can all kind of learn from each other, but we're likely to have 1 or 2 that are really strong within us. As for how we relate to those gifts that are not ours, I would say the first thing is humility. Man. I used to spend a lot of time being really frustrated with people, because I'm like, it's obvious, people. How are you looking at it and clearly nothing is penetrating that thick noggin of yours? And what I realized, one, that I knew much less than I thought I did, which I think is, I hope I'm not the only one who can look back on myself in my 20s and be like, you knew so much less than you thought you did. But I also realized that they couldn't understand what I was seeing for the same reason that I couldn't understand what they were seeing. And that is that we were very much in our angle. So first off, having the humility to recognize that there are going to be parts of the picture that jump out at you because of your spiritual gifting. And those are not the same parts of the picture that jump out at somebody else. And by the way, neither is the full picture. And so it's really coming together and like listening and understanding where people are coming from and taking it, honestly, having faith that they too are being led by the same spirit. And that's a big part of it. Does it mean that, everybody's always right all the time? No, it most certainly does not. But it does mean that we really need to sit with humility and hold each other in grace and listen to each other and recognize that they might be coming at things at a different perspective. And even when we disagree, lift up. I think this is really important. I read this book on the practice of affirmation as a spiritual discipline and community, lifting up what we see in each other that's good as really, really, really important, so that we can say, I hear that it's really important to you that our community be safe and welcoming. And I agree. It is so important that our community be safe and welcoming, because that's part of how we show God's love for each other. But I have a concern, and that is that we're leaving certain people out. And that's also part of showing God's love to each other, is by being welcoming to those people as well. So how do you think we might move forward in a way that honors what you're prioritizing and also honors what I'm prioritizing? Because I think they're both important.
Have you seen any examples of compelling evangelism, specifically of noticing the question of who's being left out of our communities, and then trying to make them more accessible? Are there any examples of that process that have struck you recently?
There are a couple. I think the success was mixed, but for example, noticing. So when what can I say? So like in the height of the pandemic lockdown, at my meeting, we had a couple of young families who had just started coming to meeting, maybe like 2 or 3 months before COVID hit. And once COVID hit, no families were coming to meeting. I didn't even log on to Zoom worship for like 6 months because I just could not. I was so overwhelmed. And we sent out a book. It's a really good book. It's on my shelf, but too high to reach, otherwise I'd show it. It's called Faithful Families, and it's a book of like spiritual disciplines and practices that you can practice like with kids of different ages in the family. And just MNC wrote a note, stuck it in the book, mailed it to all of the families of young kids in our meetings, basically saying, we love you, we miss you, let us know how we can help, and whenever you're ready to come back, we can't wait, and here's something for your family in this time. And it meant a lot. And they actually got like response letters and emails from families who said like, wow, we thought everyone had forgotten about us. And it meant a lot to know that you hadn't. So it's a small thing, but it was noticing who wasn't there, who wasn't present, and reaching out.
There's a great abundance of beautiful questions that we won't get to address all of. One of the themes emerging is whether you have suggestions, in addition to the resources that you shared, about conversations around recognizing and supporting spiritual gifts within your meeting, specific activities or worship sharing or other ways of engaging in that process.
I don't, but that is a really, really awesome question. That's a really, really good question. And that's something that I would like to explore, because I just finished facilitating literally on Saturday. I finished facilitating a 2-month workshop with the Kalamazoo meeting online. And that was around a Pendle Hill pamphlet called Marking the Quaker Path. And it was like a spiritual deepening thing for their annual retreat. And it was such a beautiful experience to walk with that meeting as they consider these questions in a deep and thoughtful way. And I was wondering, what's the next step in creating spaces and resources for meetings to like deepen their life together? So maybe this is it. maybe this is next season. Maybe this is the work of next season. I will say that one of the things to do is go back to those questions, where ask each other the two questions that I asked at the beginning of the talk, where if everybody could give some time and reflection, maybe you could do this as a second hour religious ed. Where do you feel, in what types of situations do you feel that God uses you most powerfully? And in what types of situations do you feel in most conflict with your meeting? And oftentimes those are the same thing. And that will often be your area of gifting. Because that's the area where you have a special care and concern that God has laid on your heart. And you might be the only person who sees it in a situation in your meeting, but you can't not see it, because that's how you're wired and that's how you're oriented. And that's a good thing. Doesn't mean you should get to run the show. I sometimes joke, if I were queen of Quakerism, it would be a disaster and nobody would ever have coffee, because I'd be like, yeah, well, the Spirit's going to take care of it. It's like the Spirit will not make the coffee. We need shepherds to make the coffee. But yeah, if you ask those two questions of each other and feel free to use that chart. I was going to leave it out because I was like, there's no way you can read that on the slide, but maybe you can include that, Francis, as like a link. I would love to share that with whoever comes across the YouTube video, and use that in your meetings, and feel free to email me and let me know how it goes.
Do you want to share your email with the friends here?
Yeah, sure. It's adria.gulizia@gmail.com. Although you'll have a faster response if you Facebook message me.
I am also excited to explore with you future, possibly Pendle Hill workshops or programs, thinking about how to support meetings and exploring these topics. Maybe one or two other questions. Scripture also mentions gifts of faith, hope, love, and encouragement in different books of the New Testament. Do these fit into the categories that you talked about, or are they separate? I would
say that those are separate, and those are really things that we should all want and desire, and graces that we should all just have our hands open to receive. Can I tell you, okay, this is a little random, but my son gave his first ever live in-person meeting afterthought this past Sunday. And he came up and he said, I had a dream that I had a laser, and I got really nervous when he started like that, but the laser was going to shoot out faith and hope and love to anybody who needed it and anybody who was having a hard time. And it was the most beautiful ministry for my 6-year-old boy. And I wish for all of us that we can receive those gifts. And I think that should be our hope and expectation. As I said, there are a lot of things where our gifts are under the Ephesians 4 APEST framework will shape how it is. So it's like, if we should all yearn for the gift of encouragement, the way that a teacher encourages and the way that a prophet encourages and the way that a shepherd encourages are all going to be different. And they're all going to be shaped by your life experience and your other personality traits. So we can all, I think, and should all yearn for and expect those gifts, but understand that they're going to manifest differently depending on what other things that God is doing inside of us.
Thank you so much. I think this conversation could go on. It's generous of you to invite friends to continue the conversation offline with you. Again, we'll be posting this to YouTube tomorrow with some of the references that were shared, and also the PowerPoint. I think we can link there. I'll put that in the chat in a minute, but first there's one last question that I think it resonates a lot with, I think, many people. It says, do you have advice for how to introduce a process of understanding and using the things that you've talked about today in a meeting that is already fracturing and on the point of dissolving? in the situation where the conflicts you described suck the energy out of the community, how do we help put energy into this? It's like a person on the verge of death from hunger, but they can't absorb the nourishment. And I think I'm not necessarily going to ask you to answer that question, but I more to offer it as a the high stakes of what we're talking about here. And also I think to you had wanted to remind friends about the Testimonies to Mercy program. I know Wendy Cooler was just at Pendle Hill sharing a workshop on connection, rupture, and repair of how do we come back when we get to these moments where things feel so desperate. I think this coming Friday, Cody Hirsch is going to be facilitating a session in the Testimonies to Mercy series on how intimacy and boundaries work together to nurture community. That might be part of an answer to that. I'll be putting a few more links in the chat, but just Adria, I want to give you the final word, anything you want to sum up, and then we can share a moment of silent worship together as we close.
Thank you so much, Frances. So there are a couple of things that I will say, and one of those things is I am growing in and leaning into various types of facilitation roles and workshop facilitation, and actually had to design a conflict resolution process, help design a conflict resolution process for a meeting recently. And let's talk. I'm also looking for sources of like financial support for my ministry so I can afford to do more ministry. But let's talk, because it is this stuff really matters. Other than that, I would say I'm so grateful and so happy to have been able to share with you this evening. And I'm so grateful. As I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is strong stuff. I hope they don't run me out of here on a rail, but haha, it's Zoom, so you can't. But I was worried because we're pointing to things that are real and that are deep, and sometimes point to struggles that we're having and sicknesses sometimes in our communities. But I'm so encouraged that we friends gathered here tonight are all so committed and love our community so much and love our faith so much and love each other so much. And I just want to encourage that and bless that. And however I can help, I'm here for it. Let's do it. Let's do it, friends.
Thank you, Adria. Let's spend a minute in silence as we thank you, friends. You can find the links in the chat for the YouTube channel and the Pendle Hill. We hope you'll continue to join us in this community. Our daily worship is open to everyone online and on campus, and we have a number of upcoming programs that we hope you'll continue to participate in. And I truly echo the chat sentiments, thanking Adria. Spirit is at work here, says one friend, and thank you so much for your grace-filled message. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.